Imagine for a second that you are a teenager. You're out skateboarding, trying to figure out your place in the world, and you were just filled with that very specific, chaotic blend of youthful rebellion and profound alienation.
Right, that classic teenage angst.
Exactly. You feel completely misunderstood by your family. You feel like an outsider in your own house. And your only refuge, the only thing that actually makes sense to you, is the music playing in your headphones.
Which is such a universal experience.
It really is. But in this specific case, you're listening to this iconic, really raw Australian punk band, The Saints. You're feeling the bass in your chest, finding absolute freedom in the distortion in the lyrics. You're just playing it on repeat.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to imagine finding out decades later that the man who produced those exact tracks, the guy shaping the very sound of your teenage rebellion, was actually your biological father.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A man who lived just down the road from you. A man who knew you existed but never called.
It is, it's a scenario that sounds too meticulously plotted to be real life. Like, it feels like the climax of some indie film about destiny.
Yeah, it really does.
But we aren't talking about fiction today. We are looking at the intensely real, deeply documented life of an analytical writer and founder named Shane Paul Boole.
And today's deep dive into his life and his work is going to be heavy. I want to be totally upfront about our mission today, because the stack of materials we are exploring, so we've got Shane's personal essays, his biographical records, and the foundational texts of his publication, Thoughtless Delineation, these are, well, they're profoundly challenging.
Very much so.
We are looking at the concept of adoption, but we are absolutely not looking at it through the warm, feel-good, PR-friendly lens that society usually, insists upon.
Right, no sugarcoating here.
None at all. We are examining it through forensic auditing, existential philosophy, and neuropsychosocial frameworks.
Because Shane's work represents this really uncompromising critique of the adoption industry, child welfare systems, and the legal frameworks that govern human displacement.
And just to set the ground rules for us and for you listening, our job today isn't to tell you what to believe about adoption policy. We aren't here to endorse a specific political or institutional viewpoint.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction.
It is. Our goal is just to act as your guides through Shane's lived experience and his incredibly specific, highly structured frameworks. We are here to impartially report on a radical, disruptive way of viewing human identity. We just want to unpack the profound ideas contained in his original source material.
And to do that, we actually have to start with the foundational concept of his entire worldview. Before we can even touch the macro-level systemic critiques, we have to look at what he calls adoption qualia.
Adoption qualia. Okay, let's break that down for a second.
Yeah.
In philosophy, qualia refers to the individual subjective experience of consciousness, right?
Exactly. The classic thought experiment is the color red.
Right. So you can read a physics textbook and understand everything about how light wavelengths work. You can learn how the retina processes photons, how the optic nerve sends signals to the brain.
You can have all the data.
All the objective data in the world, but none of that data can actually describe the feeling of seeing the color red.
And when Shane applies this to adoption, he is drawing this massive, uncrossable line between the map and the territory.
The map being the legal system.
Right. He argues that the map of legal adoption is purely institutional. It is a collection of court orders, amended birth certificates, statutory frameworks, social worker reports. It's paperwork.
Yeah.
But the territory, the actual lived reality of the adoptee, is molecular. It is a deeply visceral first-person reality that simply cannot be captured by a legal document or some societal platitude.
So to understand the institutional critique he builds later, we first have to ground ourselves in his specific color red. We have to understand his specific adoption qualia, which brings us right back to that teenager on the skateboard and the unbelievable story of his birth father, a highly influential Australian music producer named Mark Moffat.
Yeah, and Shane chronicles this in a profoundly moving essay. It's titled The Bittersweet Reality of a Connection Never Made. And, Mark Moffat wasn't just a casual musician. He was a massive presence in the Australian music industry. He literally shaped the sound of generations.
But the agonizing core of this essay isn't just that Shane didn't know him. It's that Mark Moffat knew about Shane.
No.
For 8 years before Mark's passing, he was aware he had a biological son out there in the world 8 whole years. And yet he never reached out.
And that silence is where Shane's specific trauma really begins to crystallize. But what elevates this from, a tragic family estrangement into something almost cosmically cruel is the sheer proximity.
The 6 degrees of separation.
Exactly. Shane wasn't living in another country, totally detached from his father's world. His life was characterized by this bizarre web that constantly brushed him against his biological lineage without him ever knowing it.
Like the skateboarding thing. We talked about him listening to the Saints. But the coincidences stack up in ways that genuinely make you question the nature of reality.
They really do.
For instance, Shane's eldest adoptive cousin had a poster hanging on their bedroom wall from one of Mark's bands, a band called Singing in the 80s. So Shane was literally staring at a visual representation of his biological father's art in his adoptive family's home, completely blind to the connection.
And it permeates his adult life, too. It's not just a childhood thing.
Right.
Shane's wife was a singer, and she used to perform at Sanctuary Cove on the Gold Coast. And while she was performing there, she caught the ear of a man named John Swan, who goes by the stage name Swanee.
Swanee.
Right, and for those who don't know the Australian rock scene, Swanee is an absolute legend. He's Jimmy Barnes' older brother, and he actually had a history singing with AC/DC before Bon Scott took over.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so Swanee heard Shane's wife sing and actually invited her to record with him.
Okay. Let me pause you there, because the web is getting incredibly dense. What does Swanee have to do with Mark Moffat?
Swanee and Mark Moffat had incredibly deep ties. Years prior to this, they had met at Festival Records. They were introduced by another industry heavyweight, David Sinclair.
All right.
Mark had been brought on specifically to produce Swanee's track Into the Night. They were so creatively intertwined that they even formed a band together called Kilo.
Are you kidding me?
No. So you have Shane's wife brushing shoulders and discussing recording with a man who was intimately, creatively tied to Shane's biological father.
I am having a hard time even wrapping my head around the emotional weight of that. It almost feels like a glitch in the Matrix.
It does.
You know, Carl Jung talked about synchronicity, these meaningful coincidences that seem to suggest an underlying connectedness to the universe. But when you apply that to Shane's life, it doesn't feel like a beautiful universal connection. It feels like a taunt.
It's brutal because it underscores the artificiality of the separation. The universe or society or his community kept bringing him to the very edge of his biological reality, but the legal and social barriers kept him totally blind to it. When Shane writes about this, he is exploring a highly complex, very specific form of grief. He isn't just grieving a man who died. He is grieving the what if. He is mourning unresolved questions and a relationship that was essentially aborted by silence despite a massive 8-year window of opportunity.
How does a person even begin to reconcile that? Because Mark Moffat is a public figure. His legacy is celebrated. The music he produced is immortalized.
Yeah, he's everywhere.
Right. So Shane has this incredibly agonizing paradox. His only avenue to connect with his birth father is through public art. He can go stream a song that millions of other people are streaming, and that is his inheritance.
Which is so heavy.
He notes that it feels incredibly intimate, but simultaneously devastatingly distant. Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's like being locked out of your own childhood home, but you can stand on the street and listen to the music playing inside.
That's a great way to put it.
You can hear the party, you can feel the bass, but you can't walk through the front door. How does a person reconcile the public celebration of a figure with their private, profound absence?
It's incredibly difficult. Music is, at its core, a form of spiritual communication. It is an artist externalizing their internal landscape. So Shane is receiving his father's soul, his creativity, his communication, but it is broadcast indiscriminately to the masses.
It wasn't just for him.
Exactly. It was never meant for him specifically. And this dynamic introduces a vital concept in Shane's writing, the concept of ghosts.
The ghosts of almost. The ghosts of parallel lives.
Yes. Shane argues that adoptees carry a hyper-awareness of the parallel timelines that were stolen from them. People who aren't adopted might wonder about alternate choices they made, like, what if I took that job? What if I moved to that city?
Sure, normal regrets or wonderings.
Right, but for an adoptee, the ghost is systemic. It's the constant split-screen reality of the people they were supposed to know, the cultural traditions they were biologically primed to inherit, the version of themselves they would have been if a judge hadn't slammed a gavel and legally altered their timeline.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. At a certain point, don't we all have to accept the reality we are in? Like if Shane spends his whole life looking at this phantom timeline of the rock and roll father he never knew, isn't he just torturing himself?
It's a fair question, and Shane actually addresses that directly. He writes very clearly that he cannot let his life now be defined by what never happened.
Okay, that makes sense.
He acknowledges the necessity of letting those ghosts fade into the background so he can function. But the problem, and the reason this deeply informs his institutional critique, is that these ghosts didn't just haunt the birth family he never met.
Right.
The friction of his biology actively haunted the adoptive family he was actually placed into.
Which brings us to the environment he grew up in, and a psychological concept that I think a lot of people still secretly believe in today, whether they realize it or not: the myth of the blank slate.
Yeah, the blank slate. According to his biographical records, Shane was separated from his birth mother and adopted at exactly 3 weeks old.
3 weeks. I mean, from a neurobiological standpoint, that infant's entire nervous system is still expecting the heartbeat, the voice, and the smell of the woman who carried him for 9 months.
Exactly. But the adoption industry, particularly during that era, relied heavily on a foundational psychological theory called tabula rasa, or the blank slate.
Right.
It's an idea that dates back to philosophers like John Locke, but it was weaponized by social work. It operates on the assumption that a baby is essentially an empty hard drive.
Right. The theory says you can take this infant, plug them into any family, any socioeconomic environment, any culture, and they will simply absorb the expectations and personality of their new surroundings.
Yes.
They will seamlessly fit in because supposedly they have no pre-existing code.
But modern epigenetics, neurobiology, and just basic human observation entirely destroy that myth. A child is not a blank slate. They arrive with ancestral memory, genetic predispositions, inherent temperaments, and deeply embedded biological hardware.
And Shane's lived experience is a brutal testament to what happens when you ignore that hardware. When Shane was 2 years old, his adoptive mother gave birth to twin girls.
Right.
And as they all grew up together, the records note that it became undeniably physically apparent that Shane's personality, his emotional responses, his entire way of moving through the world mirrored his birth mother's. He was biologically hardwired differently than the family he was placed in.
And that biological clash led to some really devastating consequences. Shane writes, "I wasn't and I didn't fit in. He was an outsider in his own living room."
Yeah.
And his nonconformity to the adoptive family's culture wasn't met with curiosity or, therapy. It was met with ridicule, punishment, and ostracization.
There was one detail in the sources that absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I read it.
Yeah.
His twin sisters, the biological children of his adoptive parents, they attended a local day school. They went to class, came home, had family dinner, normal childhood stuff.
Right.
Shane was sent to a boarding school that was exactly 5 minutes away from their house.
The stated rationale was that it would toughen him up.
Let me stop you there. 5 minutes away. That isn't about education. That isn't about building character. That is exile.
From a psychological perspective, it is a blatant mechanism of physical and emotional distancing. The family dynamic, which was built on the false promise of the blank slate, was fracturing under the weight of his biological reality.
Wow.
So rather than addressing the complexity of the adoption, the family quite literally outsourced him.
It almost sounds like, when you try to run Mac software on a custom-built PC. The machine isn't broken, it's just rejecting incompatible code.
That's a perfect analogy.
The adoptive family was getting angry at the computer for failing to run an operating system it just wasn't built for. And instead of getting a different software, they threw the computer out the window.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like.
But I have to ask, is it entirely the adoptive parents' fault? I mean, many people would argue that the blank slate approach, however flawed it is, was born out of love. Adoptive parents genuinely want the child to feel like a seamless part of the family.
Right, they think they're doing the right thing.
If they were following the guidance of the system at the time, does the system itself bear the ultimate responsibility for setting up this fragile, trauma-bonded dynamic?
That is the exact friction point Shane forces us to examine. To really understand the toxicity of this specific family dynamic, we have to look at the adoptive mother's history.
Okay.
The sources reveal a piece of context that is absolutely staggering. Shane's adoptive mother had actually lost a son to forced adoption before she adopted Shane.
Wait. She was a victim of forced adoption herself.
Yes. So think about the psychological landscape of this transaction. The state, the child welfare system, created a massive traumatic void in this woman's life by forcing her to surrender her biological child.
Oh my God.
And then years later, that very same system offered her a different separated child, Shane, to act as the plug for that void.
But a human being can never be a plug for someone else's grief. That is a recipe for absolute disaster.
It's what we call intergenerational displacement. You have two individuals carrying profound primal wounds of separation. The mother is carrying the unresolved, agonizing grief of a stolen child. The infant is carrying the preverbal trauma of maternal separation.
Right.
The state binds them together with a legal contract, hands them a blank slate narrative, and demands they perform a happy family for society. The adoptive mother was inevitably projecting her unresolved grief onto Shane and then punishing him when his biological reality failed to soothe her trauma.
And the state doesn't just passively allow this, they actively enforce it. The sources detailed that when Shane was 16 years old, he was legally forced to sign a veto document.
Yeah, that part is chilling.
This document legally prevented his birth mother from ever contacting him. 16. I can't get over that. The state is handing a teenager a legal weapon to permanently sever his own biological origins. They're actively mandating his isolation.
It is the ultimate flex of institutional power. The state is dictating the boundaries of human connection based entirely on paperwork rather than biological reality. And the compounding trauma of this legally mandated isolation, it just echoed throughout his entire life.
Yeah.
The materials detail a period in 2012 where Shane faced a catastrophic convergence of crises. His son was diagnosed and treated for brain cancer. Simultaneously, his ex-wife had an affair, which led to the total collapse of his marriage.
That is a level of stress that would break almost anyone. You are facing the potential loss of a child and the betrayal of a spouse at the exact same time.
And in the absolute depths of this crisis, rather than finding a sanctuary in his adoptive family, the sources state that his adoptive parents actually blamed him for both the cancer and the affair.
I don't even know what to say to that. Blaming a father for his child's brain cancer.
It's horrific.
To be carrying that level of apocalyptic life crisis and to be met with blame from the people who are legally designated as your parents. It's unthinkable.
It perfectly illustrates the fragility of what Shane critiques as legal permanence versus relational permanence. A court order can mandate that someone is legally your parent forever, but a court order cannot mandate empathy.
Right.
It cannot legislate unconditional love. It cannot conjure true relational stability out of thin air. When the pressure tested the foundation of that family, the legal bonds held, but the relational bonds completely shattered.
There is a moment of light in the timeline, though. In April 2016, through an organization called Jigsaw Queensland, Shane finally located his birth mother.
Yes, finally.
They officially reunited on May 3, 2016, and they have been in daily communication ever since.
That reunion really represents a reclamation of his original biological timeline. It is him stepping back into the territory that the legal map tried to erase.
Yeah.
But if we look at the broader trajectory of his life, you realize that for the vast majority of people, surviving the sequence of events, the alienation, the boarding school, the forced veto, the unthinkable compounding crises of 2012, surviving that would be the entire story.
Most people would just retreat and try to heal in private.
Exactly. But Shane is different. He didn't just survive the machinery of the adoption system. He reverse engineered it. He took all of this pain, this incredibly messy, painful adoption qualia, and he built an entire vocabulary.
He built an entire philosophical architecture, really.
Yes, an architecture to indict the system that designed his suffering.
And that brings us to his primary intellectual output, which is the founding of Thoughtless Delineation. Now, this isn't a blog about his feelings. It is a highly analytical publication dedicated to rigorous institutional auditing.
Right. It's very academic in its focus.
He outright rejects what he terms the PR-friendly narratives of redemption surrounding adoption. He's entirely uninterested in the heartwarming Hollywood version of the Grateful Orphan.
Oh, totally.
The bio he uses for himself is fascinating. He proudly calls it an unhinged bio. He describes himself as equal parts philosopher, forensic investigator, and social arsonist.
Social arsonist. I love that.
And there's this one line. He says he moves through the adoption industry like a man carrying a lit match through a cathedral soaked in kerosene.
It is an incredibly aggressive, deeply evocative metaphor.
Let's unpack the social arsonist idea. Because normally an arsonist is a criminal, right? They are an agent of chaos, destroying something valuable, bringing down a structure that people rely on.
Right.
But the way Shane is framed here, he isn't burning down the truth. He is burning away the archival documents. He's burning the propaganda, the sanitized legislative language. He is burning away the paperwork to reveal the ancient, intricate, messy human biology beneath. He's not destroying the truth. He's destroying the paperwork, hiding the truth.
Exactly. He treats the language of child welfare as contested territory. The core thematic pillars of his work are institutional power, phenomenological reality, neuroethics, and actionable transformation.
It's so structured.
It is. And to dismantle the cathedral, he realized he couldn't use the church's vocabulary. So he developed his own specific lexicon. We've already discussed adoption qualia, but he introduces other concepts like the identity gravity well, the manufacture of consent, and a genuinely terrifying concept called administrative disappearance.
Administrative disappearance. That sounds like a term out of a Cold War espionage thriller, like someone getting thrown into a black site. What does that actually mean in the context of a social service-like adoption?
It is a literal description of the legal mechanism of adoption. Think about your own birth certificate for a second. It is the foundational document of your existence in society.
Right. It lists who birthed you, your bloodline, your origin.
Exactly. When an adoption is finalized, that original document is typically sealed by the state. It is locked in a vault. And a new amended birth certificate is issued.
Okay.
This new document literally lists the adoptive parents as if they physically gave birth to the child on that exact day.
Wait, really? It doesn't say adopted by, it just overwrites the biological parents entirely.
In most jurisdictions, yes, it just overwrites them. The original identity, the biological lineage, the medical history, the ancestral connections, they are legally wiped from state records. The state manufactures a new, legally mandated reality.
So the government is essentially acting as a bureaucratic time machine, altering the past on paper to make it look like the adoptive parents biologically produced this child.
Yes.
The child is administratively disappeared from their own bloodline. That is profoundly disturbing when you look at it plainly.
And the brilliance of Shane's framework is how he analyzes the fallout of this disappearance. Historically, when an adoptee struggles with depression, addiction, or behavioral issues, society labels it a personal failure.
Like they'll say, oh, they have attachment issues or they aren't coping well.
Right. Shane completely rejects that. He analyzes the trauma through neuroethics and what he calls an identity stress index, or ISI.
What does that actually look like in the brain? Are we talking about a constant state of fight or flight?
Yes, it's about the neurological load. He defines this trauma not as an emotional weakness, but as structural friction.
Structural friction.
Imagine the sheer cognitive dissonance required for a human brain to constantly operate under an assigned, legally engineered identity that fundamentally conflicts with its biologically autonomous timeline.
Wow.
The nervous system knows who it is, but society demands it perform as someone else. That structural friction grinds the neurological gears down over a lifetime.
It brings us right back to the Mac software on a PC analogy. The friction is the system crashing because the hardware and the software are completely incompatible. And it's not the computer's fault it's crashing. It's a massive design flaw in the forced integration.
Precisely.
But society doesn't want to admit it's a design flaw because admitting that would require tearing down a multi-billion-dollar industry. How do institutions react when someone refuses to use their sanitized vocabulary?
Well, this is exactly why society relies on euphemisms. We use terms like child welfare, family building, or finding a forever family. Shane argues these terms are nothing more than camouflage. They mask what he calls the market logic and the emotional laundering of human displacement. He's demanding that we look at the actual mechanics of the system rather than the poetry we use to defend it.
But if the system is this fundamentally flawed on a biological and neurological level, why isn't there massive public outrage? Why does society defend it so fiercely? Which I think brings up a massive point of friction in Shane's life.
Yeah, the societal pushback.
When he refuses to use those euphemisms, when he refuses to play the role of the grateful rescued orphan, the pushback he gets is intense. The sources highlight that the most common weapon used against him by the general public isn't anger, it's pity.
The weaponization of sympathy. It is one of the most insidious defense mechanisms society has. The materials include a staggering list of Shane's responses to a very specific, incredibly common societal platitude.
Right. When Shane outlines the trauma of his experience, the boarding school, the forced veto, the biological friction, people often smile sympathetically and say, I'm sorry you had a bad experience being adopted.
Yeah. On the surface, if you don't think about it too hard, that sounds polite. It sounds like empathy.
It does.
But Shane deconstructs this sympathy and exposes it as a tool used entirely to avoid conversations about justice and systemic reform.
Let's read a few of his rebuttals, because they are incredibly sharp. When someone says, I'm sorry you had a bad experience, he replies, I'm sorry you think a statutory fiction carries more moral weight than a human's right to their own history.
That's powerful.
He also says, I'm sorry you view the permanent severance of a lineage as a service rather than a systemic failure.
He is identifying a brilliant, albeit dark, sociological pattern here. When a massive institution causes harm, society's immediate defense mechanism is to individualize that failure.
Oh, interesting.
They label the victim an outlier. They
Yeah.
say, oh, you just got a bad placement, you were unlucky, most adoptions are beautiful. By doing that, society protects the institution. They don't have to acknowledge that the system is working exactly as it was designed to work.
I love how he tackles the concept of luck directly. He writes, I'm sorry you think luck is a valid defense for a system that functions on the commodification of displacement. And honestly, why on earth is luck the metric we accept for human rights?
It makes no sense.
Think about it. If you buy a toaster and it explodes and burns your house down, the manufacturer doesn't issue a press release saying, well, most people have a good experience with our toasters, you just had bad luck.
No, the government steps in. They recall the product. They investigate the wiring.
Exactly.
Mm.
But when it comes to permanently severing a child from their bloodline, altering their identity documents, and placing them in a legally binding contract with strangers, society just shrugs and says, hope you get lucky. Why is the threshold for human safety in adoption entirely reliant on the subjective luck of getting a good placement?
Because framing it as an issue of luck completely obfuscates the fundamental transaction taking place. Shane talks about the commodification of displacement. He is forcing us to see that human life, in this context, is being treated as a transaction where the price of admission is the erasure of the past.
The erasure of the past. Wow.
If society admits that erasing an infant's past is inherently neurologically damaging, regardless of how loving the adoptive parents might be, then the entire foundation of the family-building industry just crumbles.
And so, society demands gratitude from the adoptee to keep that foundation from crumbling. One of his sharpest lines in the source material is, I'm sorry you believe that gratitude is the interest I owe on a debt I never signed for.
That sentence is profound. Let's think about the legal reality of what he's saying. A 3-week-old infant cannot sign a contract.
No.
A baby cannot consent to being relocated, renamed, and having their ancestral identity legally wiped. Yet the adult adoptee is culturally expected to express lifelong, unwavering gratitude for a decision they had absolutely zero agency in making.
It's emotional extortion. It's like society is saying, we saved you, so you owe us your silence about the pain of being saved.
Sociologically, what Shane is describing here is a concept known as epistemicide, the literal killing of knowledge.
Epistemicide.
Yes, by demanding the adoptee be grateful and by labeling any critique they have as just a bad experience, the system effectively silences the lived reality of the adoptee. It kills their truth. It invalidates their adoption qualia purely to preserve the institution's reputation.
He writes, I'm sorry your moral compass is so fragile that it requires my silence to stay pointed north. He is absolutely refusing to perform the role for their comfort.
Exactly.
But what makes Shane's work so vital is that he isn't just writing philosophical poetry about his own past. He is actively tracking real-time movements in the adoption lobby today to prove his point about this market logic.
Right. Through thoughtless delineation, he applies his framework of forensic auditing to modern institutions. He points specifically to an organization called the National Council for Adoption, or the NCFA.
The sources show that the NCFA recently appointed a woman named Kate Kennedy as their president and CEO. And Shane zeroes in on a very specific detail about her background that he views as the ultimate smoking gun for his theory.
Kennedy is a high-level corporate fundraiser. Her expertise is in development, capital campaigns, and revenue generation. She is not a child welfare practitioner.
Right.
She does not have a background in social work, trauma psychology, or neurobiology.
For Shane, this proves everything he's been saying. He argues that elevating a corporate fundraiser to the head of a national adoption council signals that the industry prioritizes market logic and aggressive capitalization over actual human well-being. He defines this dynamic as regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture is a concept usually applied to finance or environmental politics. It happens when the regulatory bodies that are supposed to be overseeing an industry and protecting the public are essentially taken over by the industry itself.
They become part of the machine.
Exactly. They turn into reputation management and lobbying arms for the corporations they are supposed to police. Shane applies this to child welfare, calling it the syndicate.
So he is saying child welfare has become a vertically integrated industry.
Yes. When fundraising, lobbying, and corporate strategy take precedence over the identity stress index and neuropsychosocial outcomes of the children, the institution ceases to exist to protect the vulnerable. It exists solely to sustain itself, expand its reach, and protect its revenue streams.
So if the cathedral is soaked in kerosene, what is Shane's ultimate goal? The sources note that he acknowledged the 13th anniversary of the Australian government's official apology for forced adoptions. But clearly he believes an apology is nowhere near enough.
An apology is backwards looking. Shane is focused on actionable transformation. He demands the enforcement of international law, specifically the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 8 of that convention explicitly guarantees a child's right to preserve their identity, including nationality, name, and family relations. He is calling for absolute self-determination for adoptees.
And practically speaking, how does he want to achieve that in the day-to-day world?
He is actively seeking support to integrate adoption and forced adoption trauma education into vocational training across Australia. He wants teachers, doctors, therapists, and social workers to actually understand the neuroethics of biological separation.
To treat the root cause, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. He wants them to understand the compounding trauma so that when an adoptee interacts with the system, they are truly seen rather than just told they should be grateful.
This all leads to a really fascinating juxtaposition in his work. On one hand, you have Shane fighting this entrenched, analog, 20th century bureaucracy, paper birth certificates, sealed vaults, court orders. But on the other hand, his writings veer into highly advanced technological theory.
Yeah, it's a really interesting pivot.
The sources mention him discussing AI hitting a thermal collapse. How do those two things connect?
It's actually a brilliant synthesis of how power operates. Shane posits a future where AI reaches thermal collapse, which is a theoretical point where algorithmic systems run out of usable organic human data to scrape, or their processing capabilities simply fold in on themselves.
Okay.
He argues that when the digital illusion collapses, the only undeniable truth left will be biology, human consciousness, molecular reality.
Let me make sure I'm following this. He's saying that for a century, we've allowed an analog bureaucracy to legally overwrite a human being's biological identity using pieces of paper and euphemism.
Yes.
And if we don't wake up to the horror of that manual erasure, we're going to be entirely defenseless when artificial intelligence systems begin algorithmically overwriting our identities in the future. It seems like Shane is warning us that if we don't understand how institutions overwrite human identity manually, we are totally unprepared for how AI will do it automatically.
That is exactly the warning. He is tracking the architecture of sovereign power, whether it is housed in a dusty government archive altering a birth certificate, or in a massive silicon server farm altering digital reality.
That is terrifying, but incredibly profound. And this raw, uncompromising energy doesn't just live in his essays. The sources also mention his broader creative outputs, specifically an upcoming musical project titled Tremolo in the Underworld, scheduled for release in February 2026.
And the sonic description of this project perfectly mirrors his intellectual frameworks. It is described as a post-hardcore surf record built on concrete memory.
Concrete memory.
Yeah, it has this underground grunge weight. The promotional text describes tremolo running like voltage through empty pools and brutalist shadows. No nostalgia, no polish.
No nostalgia, no polish. That is the exact thesis of Thoughtless Delineation. It's the sonic equivalent of him rejecting the sanitized, PR-friendly adoption narrative. He is refusing to smooth the edges for the listener.
He's making you feel the friction.
Exactly. He's taking the trauma, the structural friction, the ghosts of his biological father's music, and he is returning it to the world as brutalist, unpolished voltage.
He has taken the silence that the state demanded of him, the silence of the forced veto, the silence of the blank slate, and he has transformed it into a remarkably articulate roar. He has provided us with a lexicon adoption qualia, administrative disappearance epistemicide that allows us to finally see the machinery of the adoption industry operating behind the curtain.
We have covered immense ground today. We started with the incredibly intimate, almost cinematic grief of a teenager listening to a lost father's punk records. We walked through the suffocating, scientifically baseless cruelty of the blank slate myth.
Yeah.
And we followed Shane Bowl as he forensically dismantled the adoption industry, exposing it as a financialized institution that commodifies human displacement.
And the genius of his work is that it doesn't just apply to adoptees. It trains the eye to see invisible architectures of power everywhere.
It really does. I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. Even if you aren't adopted, even if the child welfare system has never touched your life or your family, Shane's frameworks force us to ask some deeply uncomfortable, universal questions.
They absolutely do.
Look at your own life. What other institutions in our society demand your silence in exchange for belonging? Where else in your workplace, your community, or your family dynamics are you accepting curated lies over uncomfortable truths just to keep the peace? Where are you being asked to be a blank slate for someone else's comfort?
And as you go about your day, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought experiment based on Shane's warnings about the future.
Okay.
If Shane Boole has proven that human identity is a fragile molecular truth that can be legally erased by a bureaucrat's pen stroke in the name of welfare, think about our modern, digitally integrated lives. Every day, we blindly click agree on terms of service agreements. We sign away the rights to our digital identities, our behavioral data, our personal histories, handing them over to corporate algorithms in exchange for convenience. If a piece of paper can erase a human's past, what happens when the algorithm decides who you are? Are we all, right now, slowly volunteering for our own administrative disappearance?